We actually ask that question to a lot of people. We do this to high school students where we call it Bill Gates for a day. We say, what would you do if you had $75 billion? It turns out it's very important also to say, hey, you can't spend it on yourself. But the point is, first they think, oh, okay, I'd solve everything in the world. And then they realize that's actually not doable with 75 billion. But the second thing that happens is then they really want to make sure they do the best things first. Well, listen, I'd love to take you through basically this set of this way that we try to do priorities in the world. And you know, as Jerry, and thanks a lot for that introduction. As Jerry pointed out, we work with hundreds of the world's top economists and 7 Nobel laureates, and I think we try to set the agenda on talking about how to prioritize the world. The book you got, or the book that you can get, How to Spend 75 Billion, is actually a very short version of the 750-page book that we published with Cambridge University Press. So at least enjoy that. And you know, we've spent about 2 years preparing this with, as I said, more than 100 academics. But when Reason asked me and wanted to hear, can you take us through all the big problems in the world in about, I don't know, 20 minutes? I was like, yeah, sure. So I don't know if you, I hope you don't mind if we're just going to move right into it. So you know, the main point really here is to recognize that there are lots of problems. I've just listed a number. More than 1 billion people don't have clean drinking water. Pretty much everybody would be richer if we didn't have subsidies, certainly especially agricultural subsidies. There's 2 civil wars that start each year, cost about $60 billion each. 3.5 million, this is actually wrong, it's 4.3 million people now, estimated last week from the World Health Organization, die each year due to indoor air pollution. This is by far the biggest environmental problem in the world, yet we hear almost nothing of it. It's caused by poor people, almost 3 billion people who cook and keep warm basically with dung and cardboard and twigs and whatever they can lay their hands on. And obviously the solution to that environmental problem is not to environmentally certify dung, but to get them out of poverty. And so the point here is to recognize, you know, I find that amazing, 20% of all deaths are due to easily curable infectious diseases, something we can do at very low cost. It's very, very clear that there are lots of issues out there in the world. And the question that we try to ask is this very simple. If you had a limited amount of money, let's say $75 billion to spend over the next 4 years, that's about 15% of the global development budget. So it's not a very large amount of increase, although of course $75 billion is a significant amount of money. How would you spend that money? We actually ask that question to a lot of people. We do this to high school students where we call it Bill Gates for a day. We say, what would you do if you had $75 billion? It turns out it's very important also to say, hey, you can't spend it on yourself. But the point is, first they think, oh, okay, I'd solve everything in the world. And then they realize that's actually not doable with 75 billion. But the second thing that happens is then they really want to make sure they do the best things first. And that's really what I want to show you and give you a little bit of sense of how we're going to think about this. And I actually want you to try and do a little bit of the same work as what the Nobels did in this area. So, you know, in reality, I think the problem here is what is it we should focus on? We tend to focus on the cute animals, the crying babies, the groups with the best PR. And I would tend to say that's probably not the best way to help the world, right? It creates a state of panic. It makes us feel, oh my God, we got to do something about this. And that's, of course, great. And we all want to do good, but surely we can do better. And that's really what this is about. To say, we recognize that you want to do good. That's great. But shouldn't we start talking about how you do not just feel good, but do something that'll actually do good? So we research the cost effectiveness of proposals, and I'll show you a couple in just a little minute. And we do prioritization. But the problem with prioritization, and I think the main reason why so many people don't like me, or at least have this caricature of Bjorn being this terrible person that just put dollar signs and everything and don't care about reality or real people or something, is that when you do prioritization, you don't just say what should come on top. You also say what we shouldn't be doing first. And that obviously annoys the people who do this for a living. And not just because it's their livelihood, but also because they really strongly feel this is what we should be focused on. We have a world where many people worry about many different things. Some people are worried about the cute animals and the crying babies and so on. But we should ask, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck? So these are the 10 challenges that you also can find in the book. These are the 10 challenges that we looked for. I think most people would agree, yeah, these are really big issues that we're trying to tackle in the world. The sort of natural inclination, this is what pretty much all journalists then ask me is, so which one of these problems is the biggest problem? But that question doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, arguably the biggest problem in the world is that we all die, right? But economists would say we have a severe undersupply of immortality. But we don't quite know how to fix that problem, right? So the real issue here is not to talk about what's a big problem. They're all big problems, but it's about how do you best solve it. So it's about finding solutions to these problems and then ranking those solutions. So there can be good solutions and bad solutions to many of these problems. It actually turns out that's pretty much all the case, and I'll try to show you some of those as well. So for armed conflict, maybe it's conflict prevention, maybe it's intervention. We have good data that actually indicates how much does it cost to do a UN peacekeeping force, how much less risk is there of reversion to a civil war, for instance. We do know these numbers, and so we can actually estimate $1 spent. How much good will that do? Biodiversity, chronic disease, just one simple point. I don't know if you know, tobacco tax, for instance. We estimate in the 20th century, about 100 million people died of tobacco. But on current estimates, mainly because there's so many smokers in China and India, we are scheduled to have about 1 billion people die from tobacco. So maybe maybe we should think about that. We also talked about heart attack pills and statins earlier. There are lots of different solutions to these. They all have different costs and benefits. Why don't we take a look at what works and what doesn't and try to prioritize where can we do the most good? Of course, it gets a little more messy, but I'll get into some of these things later on. So basically, we worked with some of the world's top economists, for instance, in infectious diseases. We worked with Dean Jameson, who basically wrote the book for World Health Organization on the cost effectiveness of 200, I think they're up to 205 diseases now. So they look, for instance, and they looked at a lot of other stuff, on tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria, but they don't just say, that'd be cool to do something about. They actually go in and say, if you spend $1 on a specific way dealing with tuberculosis, you'll do $15 worth of good. For HIV vaccine, you'll do $11. It was the first cost-benefit analysis ever of HIV vaccine. And malaria does $35 worth of good. Suddenly, this becomes much less of a, which disease have I heard most of? Who looks the saddest on the pictures? But much more, what can I actually do? But of course, you all know, if you ask academics, what's the cost and benefit, you can actually tweak these in many, many different directions. So we also have 2 other perspective paper authors. They'll actually come in and say, yeah, but this, and no, but that, and all the other. So we have a lot of different information here. And then we present it to all our expert panels, including the up to 7 Nobel laureates. They listen to all these arguments, and then they make their prioritization across all the solutions. So basically, they come out with this prioritized list. That's what I want you to do today. So I'd love to go through all the 10 challenges. There's no way we have time for that. So let's just look at 2 challenges. So I basically want you to prioritize just 4 issues. And if I could just have, I understand that there's a person who is in charge at each table who have these strips. You're going to get the same advanced technology that the Nobel laureates use, only they have magnetic strips, but you'll just have to make up for that. So basically what I want you to do, could you just distribute these around the table so everyone have one set of these strips? What I want you to do is to prioritize 4 solutions to these 2 challenges. So we're going to look at hunger and malnutrition, and we're going to look at climate change. I partly picked this because I think you'd probably find this to be interesting as well, and possibly the most interesting, but I'm sure we can also have a good conversation later on about some of these other things. I'm going to try to keep this to about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some 10, 15 minutes for talks. So let me delve right into it. So what I want you to do now is take these strips and take the top 2 ones. So just look at the first 2 ones. They're the ones that are about malnutrition. And if you could then further subdivide them, so you basically have these 2 strips. It's hard apparently to do well, certainly for me. So really what I want you to do is decide, when you've listened to the evidence for these two solutions, you have to make up your mind, do you think they should be prioritized this way or this way? It's really just very simple. And as you can see, I'm sure you imagine sort of as we go along, you'll have to shift in more and more, and eventually you'll have a full prioritization. So just listen to these two proposals and find out, what do you think? If you had that money, where would you spend it first if these were the only two things that you could spend your money on? So hunger and malnutrition, clearly a huge problem. I don't think we understand it. I mean, we've just had a great dinner. About 1 billion people on this planet goes to bed hungry tonight. 1 billion people. That's not how it should be, right? That numbers remain pretty constant over the last 40 years because there are many, many more people on the planet. That means we've actually seen a significant drop in the percentage. But it's still a huge issue, 18% of world population. This is to a very large extent because we have dropped, I don't know if you remember the first green revolution back in the 1970s when Norman Borlaug essentially managed to feed a couple billion people. That's a cool thing to be able to put on your CV. But you know, also the biofuel scandal, I don't know if you know, but the US is right now putting so much corn into your cars that you're basically destroying about 5% of all calories on the planet. That's wrong in so many different ways, right? I mean, not that Europe is any better, we're just not nearly as good at producing it, but we're still trying as hard as we can. So clearly, there's a huge issue here. What we're then trying to say, there's many solutions. You can see all the papers. You can also go on our website, read all these papers. Basically, we'll look at these two solutions that you have, the R&D to increase yield enhancements and reduce chronic undernutrition in preschoolers. I just want to show you, we looked at a lot of other solutions here, crop advisory text messages, for instance, to let farmers in third world countries know when to plant, what to plant, when to take it to market, that kind of thing. Sounds like a great idea. Turns out it's not all that great. But you know, I love this idea, but you know, the numbers speak their fairly clear language. So I'm just going to look at the first two, but just realize we have looked at a lot more. So I'm, again, showing you some of the most interesting stuff. Increase agricultural research and development. Fundamentally, this is the idea of getting ever higher yields. We do spend quite a bit. We probably spend about $5 billion per year, and we estimate that we'll continue to do that till about mid-century. What the economists are proposing is spend an extra $8 billion a year up to, so we increase the total amount up to $13 billion. We have pretty good models for what that would do because we've done this in many different areas, many different places in the world. And so we estimate this would increase growth rates for crop yields about 0.4 percentage points. So not a terribly huge impact, but of course, accumulated over almost half a century, that will have a significant impact. Now, it's not going to matter all that much on GDP. It'll increase GDP a little bit, but because agriculture makes up an ever smaller part of the economy, it's actually not going to do all that much for GDP. But it's going to cut prices, and hence it's actually going to decrease the number of hungry. In a business as usual scenario, we'll see about 200 million fewer people starving. Now, what are the benefits? Well, it's easy to calculate the cost. It's basically the $8 billion discounted back from 2050 until today. And I'm glossing over a lot of stuff here because we're trying to do this in 20 minutes. But you know, in the order of a little less than $200 billion is the total cost over this half century. The benefits, and I'm going to go through several iterations of the benefits because there's actually a number of different benefits. The obvious one is we'll get cheaper food. That's actually going to be bad for producers, but it's going to be great for consumers. It's going to be much better for consumers. And because we're all consumers, overall, we're going to be much better off. So if you just count that up, simply a pure sort of consumer surplus analysis, you'll end up with about $3.5 trillion in benefits. So fundamentally, the point is we underinvest because there's a lot of people who can't buy these or make sufficient demand that the private companies will themselves make sure that they do produce these products at a higher yielding varieties. So that would clearly indicate in the order of benefit cost ratio in the order 16 to 21. So it's a great investment, which of course is also one of the reasons why most countries, most of the time, spend money on making sure we have long-term solutions to agricultural issues. But there's more to this issue. I'm going to add three other dimensions. One is it can reduce variability. Obviously, this is one of the concerns that we'll probably also have from global warming, but also simply we know that mostly people don't die because they can't afford food all the time. They die because every once in a while, food fails. So we have a big drought, or we have a storm that wrecks the whole production in an area. The food prices spike, and then you die. It's no real help that afterwards the food prices come down. So the reality here is if we could reduce the variability by getting more drought-resistant, more heat-resistant, more saline-resistant varieties, which we probably could, we could actually have a huge increase in the benefits because many fewer people would die. Now, the economists did the first estimate of the benefit of reduced variability that's ever been produced. They came out with a, I think, too high number, and certainly the Nobels didn't buy this. They probably think it's more likely in the high 20s. So I'm showing you this because that's the result. That's also what you can read in the book, but I think it's probably exaggerated, and most people criticized it for being just simply out of order. It was too large. It has two other benefits. If we increase yields, we also reduce global warming, and we benefit biodiversity. Why? Well, fundamentally, if we produce more food on the land that we already produce food on, it means that because we're going to be more people on the planet, you have to cut down less new forest. That means basically the forest will stand, and that helps biodiversity. So fundamentally, we know that this is one of the ways that we could make sure that there's more biodiversity for the future. If you estimate what are people willing to pay for this, and of course there's lots of assumptions that go into this, you probably get in the order, this would basically add another $1 trillion in benefits. If you then also estimate how much benefit would this do, because we keep the trees standing, you'll actually keep the carbon locked up in those forests, and that means you'll have less greenhouse gases, so that will probably also add another $1 trillion or so. The total benefit, if you also assume the lower one on variability, is in the order of $30 to $40 worth of good. Now, obviously, if we had much longer time, we could then have a nice methodological discussion about, do we believe these numbers? Do we believe this estimate? Do we believe that this is possible? Do we have good evidence that in case, is it just going to go into a huge big hole in government funding and all these kinds of conversations? But given we don't, I'm sorry, we'll just have to sort of say, yeah, this is probably not totally off. But the beautiful thing is, this makes it much, much more likely that when you sit and discuss, and just as you will in just a little bit of time with the person next to you, you sit and discuss which one of these should be on top. You'll suddenly be using a very different vocabulary. This is probably not so true here at the Reason conversation, but you'd be amazed when you do this. We've done this with youth politicians, with high school students, with politicians, with bankers, with pretty much anyone, any kind of group. And the amazing thing is it really changes the way you talk. Even very left-leaning politicians start talking about efficiency and where do you get the biggest bang for your buck. It changes the way you think about these conversations. And that, I think, is the ultimately best outcome because it pushes people towards being smarter. So let's assume, at least for now, that this is probably in the order of 30 to 40, simply because we'll make sure that we get more food to more people cheaper, and that is actually both good for people, but it's also good for environment, and it's good for biodiversity. The second one is a much more sort of straightforward. This first one was very much sort of research into the future will make it better. The other one is simply get food to small kids. There's about 100 million kids that will grow up being in one way or another more or less stunted. We can do something about that. It's just simply about getting food to them. It's not it's not rocket science. We have the food. We know how to do it. We also pretty much know what the cost is. This is the estimate if we actually do this just for one kid over the first 1,000 days. Very, very simple and cheap. The total cost is about $96 per kid. That feels like, we should probably do that. That'd be a nice thing to do. But it actually is much more than just a nice thing to do. Because again, we don't just say this would be good. We ask how much will it cost, that's $96 per kid, but also how much good would it do? Well, the cost is simple to do. If you do about 31 million kids a year, it'll cost $3 billion a year. And those are probably the most vulnerable kids that we're talking about that we would reach. So we'd reach, every year, we'd get a new generation of 31 million kids. So it would be about 1/5 of the total population of kids that are being born each year. So we'd really make a huge difference. But the real question, of course, is what would be the benefits? It actually turns out, and we've been trying to sell this to 60 Minutes, and I think it's a wonderful story, and it's a story that's not been told. We've been arguing for a very long time on theoretical grounds that this is a phenomenal impact, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But last year, we actually managed to publish a study from Guatemala, which very, very clearly demonstrates why this is a great idea. It's actually such that back in the late 1960s, some American researchers went to Guatemala. They found 2 small villages, and they gave the kids in those villages good food. Then they found 2 other villages next by. They were identical in all aspects, and you can kind of hear where this is going. Right? And they gave those kids bad food. It's the 60s, you could get away with that, right? But the amazing thing is they've now gone back and refound all of these kids. We found about almost 80% of them, so 3,500 kids. They're now in their late 30s, early 40s, and you can see the difference. The only difference is one set of kids got good food, the other set of kids didn't. And the difference is amazing on pretty much all accounts. So their brains developed more, their muscles developed more, they stayed longer in school, they learned more in school, their marriages are better, they have better jobs. They have fewer kids. If they're women, they have fewer miscarriages. But by far the most important thing, if you're an economist at least, is when you measure how much of a difference did this make to your income. It turns out that if you avoided being stunted, so basically a measure of being really malnourished, which of course not everybody did, but if you avoided being stunted, you would end up being 3 times richer. You'd just simply be much, much more productive. Your pay per year would be about 3 times higher. So the stunting would result in a 66% wage reduction. We estimate that about 36% of the kids would be avoided stunted if we fed them well. So fundamentally, we can make many more kids much more productive into their adult lives. We can basically make sure that even though they go to really crappy schools, which probably many of them will do, they will learn more. They will be smarter, they'll be stronger, they'll be more productive, and when they come out in real life afterwards, they will make much, much more money. They will start a virtuous circle that will mean that they will end up making a much better society for their kids, and of course, a much better family for their kids. They'll also be healthier. We know that their kids are healthier, and it will go on in that virtuous circle. If you do the math, if you just simply add up what's the benefits of this extra consumption, basically the extra income from the pay, it turns out that the benefit cost ratio is 59. So for every $1 spent, you will do $59 worth of good. This is not just based in Guatemala. This is based, we have other studies that are not nearly as long, but it's the most exciting study that we have. We have from Bangladesh and from a number of African countries. So the fundamental point here is to say, this is real world studies. This is taking into account the fact that some of this money will go to corruption. Some of it won't get to the kids. Some of them won't get what they needed and all that stuff. But even given that, we can do an amazing amount of good. And of course, remember, this is just the benefits from schooling in the sense of future income. We don't talk about the fact that this would also actually help them. I don't know, it's nice not to be stunted. It's nice not to starve. And that's also part of it, but we don't actually evaluate that. Now, my point here is simply to say, we are providing part of this conversation. We're providing the price tags, if you will, to these opportunities. This is not the only thing you want to know. But if you think about it, it's a little bit like going into a really fancy restaurant and getting a menu, and there are no prices. Unless you're really on a good expense account, that'll make you somewhat uncomfortable, right? What you're going to order and what are you going to end up paying. We put the price tags on. We put the calorie contents, how big these plates are and all that stuff. It doesn't mean you pick the cheapest, but it means you now know what you're picking and what you're getting. So essentially, this is the price list. This is the way that we have the opportunity of saying how much good do you do for each dollar. But you can decide, and you can have arguments for why some of these things are undervalued, some of them are overvalued, why you think some of them have more ethical value, and you're going to therefore decide on one or the other. But that's exactly what I want you to do. If I could ask you for the next 30 seconds, and sorry again, just 30 seconds, talk to the person next to you and convince them why they're phenomenally wrong and why they should do this instead of the other way around. So could you just discuss and decide for yourself at least, how are you going to prioritize these two? All right. Guys, I know this is, in some way, this is just unreasonable, right? But I hope that you have now decided if you were actually going to spend money, were you going to spend it on nutrition to small kids, or are you going to spend it on yield increases? But now, of course, nutrition is not the only issue. Hunger is not the only issue. And ideally, we'd have gone through all 10 of these issues and started talking about, well, how would you prioritize all of these? I'm just going to show you one other thing. So you have the other two ones that are for global warming. So if you could rip those apart, and basically your decision is, where do they fit in? Do they both go up on top, both go down the bottom? Does one of them come in the middle? So you have to decide, where would you now spend this extra money? So let me just very briefly on global warming. Yes, global warming is a real problem. There will be a significant temperature increase in the long run. I'm just showing you some of these risks that people are talking a lot about. I think perhaps it's important to emphasize two things that most people don't talk about when they talk about global warming. That the negative effects that we expect from global warming will first come in the second half of the century. Overall, overall global warming is probably good for mid-latitude and high-latitude countries, and it's bad for low-latitude countries. Essentially, where it's already pretty damn warm, it's not a good idea it gets warmer. If you live in Denmark, more warmth is perhaps not so bad. And the second thing is, nothing you do matters before the second half of the century. Even if we dramatically cut carbon emissions, it would have virtually no effect before the second half of the century. Or as New York Times put it, if we do everything Al Gore says, or if we just have a carbon fest the next couple of decades, you won't be able to measure the difference before mid-century. So it's important to recognize this is only a long-term issue. So remember, yes, there are real problems, but we often forget that this is not about putting up lots of solar panels now and doing something tomorrow. It's about putting up lots of solar panels, and you'll see a very small change in 100 years. So there's lots of solutions again, and you can see we actually had a lot of different papers on it because it's a lot of different disciplines you get in. I'm just going to look at two things. One is the solution that everybody signed up to, a carbon tax that will, which we expect is probably the most effective way of cutting carbon emissions, that will limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You already know this is artificial limit when it's sort of an even number, right? But it just turns out that way. And the second one is to make green energy cheaper through innovation, so the R&D solution. As you can see, there's lots and lots of other solutions, and I'd love to talk more about them, but again, I just wanted to get 4 solutions in here. So the 2-degree limit. We know we can do it, or actually it's kind of hard to do it. But obviously we can just make an arbitrarily large carbon tax and then we can cut as much CO2 as we want. It turns out that actually if you look at the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, which has all the energy models that we run, that's typically considered the gold standard. It's what everybody uses, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, the EU. Well, the EU only uses the cheap ones. But fundamentally, the idea here is to say if you run half of the models say we can't do it. So we're already running on the optimistic set of models. And they basically say, sure, you can, but it's going to cost you a very, very large amount of money. It's going to be, a $68 ton of carbon tax for the world. So that's also China and India. Of course, there's some political issues with that. And rising to $4,000 per ton by the end of the century. Just to give you a sense of impact, that means 60 cents on the gallon now, and about $25 per gallon of gasoline in 2100. That's not a trivial amount. I think that would probably be hard to get through in the US, I'm guessing. And it would be almost fantasy to imagine getting this anywhere else. There's actually a lot of countries that wouldn't be able to afford this of their GDP, right? So it's by all means an exceptionally hard target. All leaders, political leaders, including Obama and Merkel and everybody else, have signed up to this, but of course it doesn't actually mean they're going to do it. But this would be probably the cheapest way to do it. It would reduce temperatures from about 3.5 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees. That's by definition, it would achieve that. It would be phenomenally expensive. The models, and this is the average of all the macroeconomic models, indicate that the cost would be about $40 trillion per year by the end of the century. That would be about 13% of global GDP. That's actually in line with what it seems like the UN climate panel is going to come out with on Monday. So it's very much in the ballpark of what everybody comes up with. There would also be benefits. We would have reduced the worst of global warming, but of course it would not be in the same order of magnitude. It would probably be about $2 trillion. And remember, the benefits would come much further out, whereas we'd start paying very soon. And that's why the total benefit cost ratio works out to about 2 cents per dollar. So for every dollar you spend, you'll avoid about 2 cents of climate damage. Now that's not zero, but it's not terribly good. You could obviously have done 98 cents more good if you'd just given people the dollar. So it's not a particularly good solution, right? But it's there because this is actually the one that we talk about. Obviously, if you had much, much lower carbon taxes, you could actually get one that was above 1. You could get one that gives you $1.50 back on the dollar, which is, of course, why most economists would say if CO2 is a problem, you should tax it at the marginal cost, which is probably about $5 per ton. So if you could get a global $5 carbon tax and offset it on other taxes, you could probably actually end up with a small positive. But it's very, very hard to get it above a small positive, or a small benefit cost ratio, a little above 1. So this gives you about 2 cents back on the dollar. But there's another solution. Basically increase dramatically green energy research and development. Essentially make the next generations of green energy much, much cheaper. If you do that, you will essentially fix global warming in the long run because you will make possible solutions that will eventually be marketable that will make everyone want to switch. So China and India and everybody else will switch, not because they're forced to by a Kyoto-style treaty, but simply because green energy is so cheap, preferably cheaper than fossil fuel, that everybody will switch. And we've seen that certainly in a small kind of way in the US. You have, for entirely different reasons, the DoD probably spent about $10 billion in subsidizing the early fracking results. And fracking now, of course, has made gas so cheap in the US that you have cut about 300 megatons of CO2 per year in the US. Of course, that was not at all your intention. You just realized it was really cheap. And so you switched from coal to gas. And since gas emits about half the amount of CO2 per energy unit produced, you've actually cut about these 300 megatons. And compare this to the fact that all the world's wind and solar cuts about 275 megatons. So you've actually sort of inadvertently ended up cutting more CO2 than all the world's wind and solar together every year. And you've done so because you've made gas cheaper. So whereas the rest of the world, and you also, are paying about $60 billion for solar and wind, you are making about $100 billion on fracking. And the simple point is it's a lot easier to convince everybody, would you rather cut more CO2, and make a lot of money, than pay a lot of money and cut less? And that's why if we could make this happen, and not just for fracking, obviously, if we get China fracking, we'd probably do a lot better. But of course, in the long run, we also need to move away from gas. So if we could eventually get real green solutions to be so cheap that everybody wanted them, that would actually be a phenomenal impact. So they estimate we'd need to spend about $100 billion per year in the long run. Remember, right now, the world probably spends about $200 billion in global warming policy, so still be cheaper. But it's not an insubstantial amount of money. But we actually estimate that the benefit cost ratio, and obviously that's a huge discussion on exactly how do you do that in long-term development and technology, but it's in the order of magnitude of $11 back. So for every dollar spent, you'll avoid about $11 of climate damage. So the reality here is, again, as I also tried to point out, it's not that there's one problem and it's either a good problem or bad problem. You can have really bad policies and you can have pretty good policies for both of these areas. And so the real issue here is to say, well, what would you want to choose? And if you put this question to people, even very left-wing people, I've done this, they will sit and say, well, I like global warming and I think it's a huge problem, so I'll move both of my strips a little up. And some of you in here will probably move it a little down, and that's fine. But you're informed by the rationality of the conversation of saying, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck? And that, I think, is the real trick that we actually end up doing much, much smarter. So if I could ask you to then just have that conversation with the person next to you, how are you going to mesh all these 4 in there? And then we're just very quickly going to do a survey, and then we'll have a result from the room. Now, I would, again, if we'd had a lot more time, we'd have had a lot of really interesting conversations about how do we believe these models work. We would have had a lot more things that we would have talked about. One of the things I'd love to talk about is education policy, because everybody loves talking about education. It turns out that we have very, very poor education solutions. So again, my sense is maybe we should fix something we know how to fix rather than fix stuff we don't know how to fix. There are lots of other things, but you've just prioritized 4 issues. And I'm just simply going to do a very, very brief survey. I'm just going to ask you to vote for your top solution. So I'm not even going to talk about the 2 top ones. Normally, when we have the Nobels and we have much more time, we take the median of all the rankings of the different impacts. But I just want to see a show of hands so we get a sense of what does the room think. So if I could ask you, who votes for the R&D to increase yield enhancements? Just raise your hand if that's your top priority. Wow, is there an issue here in the room? It seems like all the agricultural people over here. All right, reduce chronic undernutrition in small children. All right, that looks like the winner. Who is going to go for a high global carbon tax? There's usually 1 or 2 people who feel sort of slightly intimidated and will go, yeah, and that's great. Well, you guys are 0. And increased green R&D. There you have it. The point here, and I think it's very obvious that we all picked the chronic undernutrition, and it's probably also reasonable to assume that this room actually came out pretty much in according with the ranking of what the economists would do. Now, it's not very surprising in the sense because we don't have all that much other information, but the beauty of this, I think, is really that it allows us to have a conversation that suddenly makes it legitimate to ask, what is the bang for the buck? If you look in your book, you can actually see the Nobels ranked about 40 different proposals. And they came up with arguments for why some of these things are phenomenal, why some of them are not so phenomenal, and why we definitely shouldn't do some of them. And the amazing thing is this really impacts and influences a lot of conversations. Obviously, the fact that climate comes in the bottom pisses off people who do climate. But likewise, the people who do nutrition love us. Yeah, and again, not surprisingly, but the World Bank has changed their position on nutrition. A lot of development agencies are now giving a lot more money to nutrition. And actually, just last year at the last G8, Britain managed to get donations for about $12 billion, mostly argued on the background of Copenhagen Consensus. And that's, of course, wonderful, because essentially this pushes us to do better. We don't do well. There's still lots of stuff that we waste money on. But if we can push the conversation towards smarter decisions, I think we've done a good job. So could I ask you, what are your questions? So let's open up for questions, and let's get some conversation going. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.